Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Real Talk. It's Lucas here, and I hope that today's episode informs and inspires you to have your own real conversations. As always, today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Trivan, maker of trucks, trailers, and enclosure buildings tailored to your needs. Be sure to check them out at trivan.com. A huge thanks to them for sponsoring the show and making it possible. One other quick note before we get into today's episode is that if you are willing and able, if you could leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on any of the podcast networks or platforms that allow for it, such as Spotify or Apple Podcast, that will be much appreciated as it helps get the word out there and lets people know what we're all about. So, with that in mind, on to the episode.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Real Talk. It's Lucas back for this episode. I know Tyler's been carrying the load for the last few, and we've had great episodes. I've enjoyed listening to them more as just a listener and a fan. It's been great to learn about church discipline and church history. But on today's show, we have a kind of an interesting collaboration. We've got two gentlemen, two pastors, Reformed guys from the States. And I know we have some of our audience is American as well, so they might appreciate this even more. But they are two pastors who have their own podcast. So doing something never before seen, a podcast collaboration. Who would have thought? And we're talking to them, and we're going to learn all about their podcasts, what they kind of cover, a lot of church stuff, cultural stuff in America, and some various themes that overlap with what we've talked about on this show as well. So they're here to give their insight and their perspective. And it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Andrew Smith and Caleb Castro. So guys, I'll start alphabetically with first names there. Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself, who you are, where you come from, your journey to being a pastor, and then we'll flip it over to you, Caleb.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. My name is Andrew Smith. I am the pastor of Westminster Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Hamel, South Dakota. It's a church of about 25 members in a town of about 11 people. You did hear that correctly. We're a very rural area, mostly farmers and ranchers out here in South Central South Dakota. I grew up in Wyoming, next state over. You'll notice my if you have a video, wall of license plates behind me. Most of them are Wyoming plates because that's where I lived most of my life. I grew up evangelical. I actually grew up in the Christian and Missionary Alliance, which is sadly a denomination that recently started ordaining women as ministers. So it was a sad development there. Then eventually it ended up being various kinds of Baptists. Never actually knew Reformed theology was a thing until I was in college. And Wyoming is just such a small thing. There's maybe like a half a dozen Reformed churches of any kind in Wyoming that I just didn't even know anything about it. And I actually learned about it through a church that was heavily influenced by guys like John MacArthur and John Piper and so forth. Where I was first introduced to Calvinism, and it caught my attention because in my evangelical upbringing, there was a lot of questions, a lot of doubts, a lot of things in the Bible that just didn't make sense to me. And like the way I'd always been told, well, this is what this means. I'd read the Bible and it's like, it doesn't seem to make sense. And Reformed theology seemed to answer all of the questions that I had in my mind. It actually presented the scriptures, presented doctrine in a way that made sense to me. That actually, made it where the pieces fit together. Because, like I was raised a dispensationalist in the era of Left Behind. Everything was rapture this, rapture that, tribulation this, tribulation that. And I read the Bible, I'm like, I don't see this there. But then I learn about covenant theology. I learn about the related views of eschatology. It's like, oh, this makes a lot more sense. And so I just learned about it in college, continued to learn and study. I went into the workforce for about 8 years. I worked in banking and finance, and then I worked in state government in Wyoming. And then about the time a little bit after I got married, my wife and I joined a Presbyterian church, a PCA congregation. And then a couple years after that, I was given the opportunity through a financial donor to go to seminary. I'd been helping teach Sunday school and things like that, and people had began to recognize and sense perhaps a calling on my life for the ministry, and the donor offered to send me to seminary. And so I went to Westminster Seminary in California. It was there that I met Caleb. We came in at the same time. Had a bit of a fascinating time. If anyone follows all our work and you hear the things we talk about and some of the doctrinal views typically associated with Westminster, California, they're like, wait, what? You went there? If you didn't already know. Yeah, because, I found some of those views to be questionable at best, problematic at worst. But I did stay there. I did finish studying there, whereas Caleb, bailed and left me, but, I forgave him. But yeah, and then I was actually in seminary. I was in the United Reformed Churches. I came to be a part of that, even went through candidacy in the URC. And then because God has a sense of humor, after I'm like near the end of the process in the URC, I get called to the OPC and have to do a whole new set of ordination trials in the OPC. So I did ordination on like ultra hard mode, but God has been faithful. He's called me to a great congregation. I've been here. I started serving as stated supply here almost a year ago, was ordained and installed back in April, and the Lord has blessed us, and it's been a great thing out here. So.
Okay, that's quite the journey. Very detailed. I appreciate that. That's great to know. All right, Caleb, let's try to match that. What's your story? Where you come from?
Yeah, so I was born in the great conservative bastion of the People's Republic of California in the northern sector. Yeah, so Sacramento, born and bred, and the gist of it is, others might be here a couple hours. It's I was raised in a line of hyper-charismatic churches. So I grew up like your ideal preachers are Joel Osteen and Kenneth Copeland, all the fun people. So I was raised in this group called the Vineyard Charismatic Churches, a offshoot of Calvary Chapel. Eventually I got pretty heavily involved in a group called Bethel Church in Redding, California, who are very similar to Hillsong, and started seeing just some really strange, disturbing teachings that I started asking, hey, what's the biblical basis for this? And they couldn't show me it. So I left that, partied around and had a pretty rough going for a while in life. And then, the Lord grabbed a hold of me and straightened me out. I started understanding exactly what his grace is. I eventually found, he was leading me to want to really do nothing but teach the scriptures and talk about him with people all the time. So I went a little bit older in life, went out to a Bible college. Wasn't sure if I wanted to be a teacher or a pastor or whatever, but the Lord brought me to the route of seminary at Westminster, California. About that time, I had joined the United Reformed Churches, my wife and I, who had been from a Roman Catholic background. So we basically walked together in learning and studying Reformed doctrines and growing in Scripture, as a couple, similar to Andrew and Heidi. So I went out to Westminster, California, and like Andrew said, we started there after about a year and a half or so. I had been really convicted for a while that just that wasn't where the Lord had wanted to prepare or train me in the things of Scripture. So seeking much counsel from plurality of advisors, ecclesial and lay. transferred out to Mid America Reformed Theological Seminary in Dyer, Indiana. We became members at Oak Glen United Reformed Church in Lansing, Illinois. I did several, like 5 internships or so. I did my candidacy process in the URC, and I came out and did an internship in Rock Valley, Iowa, in Northwest Iowa, just about 25 minutes away from Dordt University. And they called me as their minister in May. So I've been ordained and installed, and we've been just greatly loving it here. So still kind of getting into the routine, brand new minted minister. I have some energy, perhaps a little bit of fire, and looking forward to seeing what the Lord and His grace continues to do, in however long He would have us serving.
Fantastic. Okay, so two young, fresh ministers, 2 guys with interesting journeys. Okay, and then you have this podcast. This podcast is called Once for All Delivered, OFAD, as I see you guys like to call it for short. So if people want to check that out, feel free. I'll flip it back to Andrew here. Do you want to tell us a bit about the genesis of this podcast? How long you've been doing it? Has it just been you guys the whole time? Anybody else involved? What's the story of the pod?
So we started talking about this. It was probably late 2019. I think it started with a joke among friends about doing a podcast called Bavcast, talking about Bavinck. This is the Bavinck Renaissance. Everybody's getting into Bavinck. New Bavinck works are appearing and being published and stuff. And so we're like, it'd be cool to do that. But, we were seminary students. We were interns. We were busy. We had a lot of life going on. And then in the spring of 2020, this thing called COVID, you might have heard of, came, and suddenly we're all cooped up in our houses and need something to do. So we decided, okay, we've talked about doing this podcast. Let's give it a go. So originally we started with 3 hosts. It was Caleb and I, and then also our friend Mark Scaturo, who is now an OPC minister in Michigan. He was OP the whole way. He never switched like I did, but it was started as the 3 of us. And for about 4 months, it was the 3 of us together. We started by basically just walking page by page through the wonderful works of God, which had just been republished at that time by Westminster Seminary Press, and just going through the sections and talking about it, talking theology. Mark left that summer. It got to be too much to do podcasting with life and family stuff. And then we continued on. I kept doing the wonderful works, but then we kind of branched off, would do other topics. Like if it was something, we did special episodes like on worship, on the church. We did a series on covenant theology. It was kind of just, where whatever we felt like talking about, whatever we thought would be helpful to talk about, but then, kind of using Bavinck and his works as our starting point. We got to have some guests on. We had James Eglinton on about the time he was publishing his biography of Bavinck, and Dr. Alan Strange from Mid America, Bruce Pass. It was really kind of fun to explore the world of Bavinck for the time that we did. That was Bobcast. We did that for a couple of years, and then near the end of last year, we decided we had taken some time off, kind of regroup, rethink, and then we decided we wanted to come back as something more broad, more general purpose, kind of more free in the topics we could talk about. I mean, we love Bavinck, but it's also, with all the things going on in the world and our various theological interests and stuff, it's like, let's do something more general so we can kind of just follow things where they lead, as opposed to kind of being nailed down to one author and his works.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Okay, cool. And then so you kind of explore the Bavinck thing. You just work through his theology. Before we move into some of the more recent episodes, after you kind of rebranded and went in a broader direction, any highlights or anything that stands out to you about that period in time? Like, what was this? There's a lot of theologians out there. What was the real interest in Bavinck that drove you guys, Caleb?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, when you compare a lot of say single volume systematic theologies that are out at present, you don't have many comprehensive dogmatics, ones that are really drawing from first of all a truly exegetical basis in scripture, but then moving in looking through historical exegesis, that is the consensus that formulates our confessions. So truly, those who do then confessional theology interact with others in the past, those who are interacting with other views, from the past as well, from Lutheran, Roman Catholic interpretations, eclectic theology, really comparing things. Why are we Reformed and not Roman Catholic? But then also those who theologians that engage with thinkers of their own times. Bavinck was doing all of that. So for a relatively recent, modern theologian, having access in English to a fairly, as I said, comprehensive body of work to draw from, it's an enormous gift, an enormous resource for interested people to really go into. But Bavinck's also not just a dogmatician. He had been a statesman. He was involved in Dutch politics for a time. He was a pastor and preacher. He was writing very much on what, if you want to put it this way, what's the point of theology? Well, there is no point of theology unless it's practical, unless theology must be practical by its nature. If we're to study God, there must be a fruit from it. So in a lot of ways, Bavinck for us, we never would have professed and do not profess being, and you say it right, actually, Bavinck. Bavinck is really, readily admitted, far above us, and in a way, what we were doing was reading and learning from his writings in various areas, and inviting others in an open format, really. I mean, in listening to podcasts for people to join in on our thoughts as we do these things.
Right.
So that kind of sense. Yeah, sorry.
I was gonna say, so if I hadn't read Bavinck before, would those podcasts be accessible? Like, do you guys work through it?
Yeah, we don't do it, say, to the extent of something like Comparison Reform Forum with their boss group, where it's almost exegeting, Gerardus Voss, paragraph by paragraph.
Right.
So we try to keep it in a somewhat, moving fashion. So we'll read certain portions or at least summarize sections, and then we'll just kind of say, okay, well, here's what he's thinking, here's what he's saying here. And sometimes we'll draw in references from his, we mostly work through his essays and the Wonderful Works of God. But we would draw in references from the Reformed dogmatics and elsewhere.
Gotcha.
So I would hope that it's that it is accessible and helpful.
Okay. Nice. Cool. Well, if anyone's interested, feel free. We'll link it in the show notes below. Definitely go check that out.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we should hit some of your more recent episodes, because then once you kind of broaden out, there's a lot of cultural topics you hit, and a few interviews and whatnot too. One of those being the Faith in the Film guys. They're actually from up our neck of the woods, quote unquote. It's a big country, but I believe those guys are from Alberta somewhere. So maybe Well, actually, that reminds me, they are coming on our show at some point soon too. So they'll be coming down and doing an in-person interview with Tyler at his place. So stay tuned for that. Yeah,
very good. I was actually just gonna email Kyle after this and let him know that we were gonna plug them a little and just say hi.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, good folks.
It's the pre-plug before the full episode, so I'm sure we'll just whet the listeners' appetite, So, do you want to tell us a little bit about those two gentlemen, what they're up to in their project? We'll just keep it going. I'll flip it back to Andrew, unless Caleb, you feel real strong about something to say there.
Yeah. It was Caleb actually that got us set up with them through some mutual friends. But given that, in our new format, we're particularly interested in issues of theology and culture, we liked the opportunity and the ability to talk to some guys who are Christian and thoroughly Reformed Christian, and yet engaged in cultural production, making films, making resources. At least at the time we talked to them, their primary focus had been on theologically educational films for the church, basically providing learning resources, introductory resources to Reformed theology. But it was good to talk to them because they're, making art, making film as Christians to help the church, but also just one of the things, and this will probably come up as we talk about some of the other topics we've hit on OFAD. We're recognizing a need in our time as Christians that we need to be thinking of building institutions, thinking of building our own infrastructure as far as cultural production, education, things of that sort, because we are living in very difficult times and we are seeing attacks on the church and on Christianity from all sides. So it was just a good opportunity to talk to brothers who are actually putting that in action and doing that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Caleb, so how did you get in touch with those guys? What was the connection there?
Yeah, so I went to seminary with now a minister out in Abbotsford, Reverend Aaron Vanderheiden. So he graduated about a year before me, and he went up and did an interview in the URC in Lethbridge. And so in that time, that's how he got to know the Faith the Film guys. So he originally pitched the idea, hey, you guys should connect and talk, and we did, and after there was kind of a little several month lull, but as things were busy, but eventually, especially given the newer format with what we did with Once for All Delivered, and transitioning over to that format, Andrew and I were talking and thought, hey, this would be a good time to bring in some guys and talking about the area of media and arts. So that mutual friend had done the initial work in copying us to each other in an email, much like as we'll talk about later, Dr. Van Dam did here with you guys. As I was corresponding with Kyle from Faith the Film, he there's at least what I hope something of a click, mutual interests, concerns, and so we I think in the course of our interview with them, that was a great time. We got to talk on perhaps one of the most, I think for me, interesting areas of how do you be a Christian on the internet? How do you produce content, on the air, or how do you do film when you look at this like heavily secularized age? Kyle, I think it was, worked for for a production company for a time, and as I'm sure he would tell you, it's he had a hard time reconciling those kind of things to his views, and he knew, and many others in our Christians in our world know what it is to have to say, I don't want to progress with this avenue of a career. I don't want to keep going with this if it's going to mean that I'm shirking off my faith in Christ, that I am not showing it rightly. It's a huge question of we have this massive tool of the internet, a great potential ministerial tool, perhaps the biggest innovation in technology since the printing press. And we saw how the printing press was used in the Reformation in educating, and bringing awareness to others on the things of Scripture. Well, we have this tool of the internet. How do we do the same now today? Right. So in part, that's why, Andrew and I also do this with the podcast. However many people, listen, even if it's just one that we might be able to be utilized, for the edification of them, for their edification, then I think I would hope that that's a good end.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to think of these developments in technology on a larger time span, and like with the printing press is a fantastic example, right? And granted, things did move slower back then, and change happens so quick these days, but we are still very much in the infancy of the internet age. And another topic we'll hit later, obviously, is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Which to me, that's so fascinating. I want to do a full episode on that at some point, but I got to track down a good expert first, because it's such a new field and Christians have only been talking about it for a few years. So yeah, whatever. It's that's all candy for podcasters like us who just love talking about these things. So it's exciting.
Exactly.
It's exciting. Okay, cool. So that's the Faith and Film, guys. Stay tuned for that, listeners. That's coming up. In the meantime, though, let's talk about this seems to be recurring theme of Satanism. We were joking about it before the podcast started. It's the darkest of dark humor, I suppose, in some ways. But you guys started with this episode called "The Devil Went Down to Hollywood," I believe, and you were looking at entertainment culture, Hollywood, the impact of Satanism in that arena, and it's kind of become a theme for your podcast that you everywhere you look and the issues you discuss, you find the devil, and you're like, this is crazy. What's so much Satanism going on here? Which maybe it's not crazy. Do you guys want to kind of break that episode down, tell me a little bit about how that went for that Devil Went Down to Hollywood, and then touch on this recurring theme of Satanism you're finding in your work, especially when you delve in stuff like Pride Month? Go ahead on that, Andrew.
Yeah, so the Devil Went Down to Hollywood is basically, it started as we wanted to do a live show, and we've been we don't do all our shows live now, but more and more we've been getting into video. We've been getting into live production. We started as a audio only show, but have been working on branching out and doing more things. And Caleb pitched the idea of talking about the controversy at the time, which was that Sam Smith had performed at the Grammy Awards and using a lot of overtly satanic imagery. And oh, by the way, also his co-performer, I guess, was a transgender individual, was a man who was pretending to be a woman, which is really interesting because that correlation has come back over and over again as we've hit LGBT type issues. Looking at Pride Month, we did an episode particularly on transgenderism. These things really do like to run together. Like, for instance, with when we did our Pride Month episode, we were talking about Target and their clothing line for Pride Month that was designed by a Satanist. It's like, okay. So, it started with that look at Hollywood, and we looked at some other examples of how Satanism, seems to have infiltrated Hollywood. Now, the thing about Satanism is it almost is, even for the people who hold to it and practice it, it's supposed to be like almost a joke and just a way to punch back at religion and particularly at Christianity. But then it's like they kind of end up telling more truth about themselves and about this present evil age than they maybe intend to.
For sure. So any specifics on you dive into that Hollywood episode, obviously Sam Smith, satanic imagery there. Did you guys discuss any other instances or cases where that's kind of come up in pop culture recently, other than the Target one you listed?
Yeah, a couple of them. So one I'm trying to remember if it was just about that time. It's been a while now. But there was buzz going around about a large meeting of Satanists in Boston, Massachusetts, back in I think May or so, and so you have this huge gathering where you have people dressing up in costumes, we put it a little tongue in cheek in the way of where you have just a bunch of honestly edgy young adults and adults going and gathering in Gothic clothing and stuff, and and flaunting flaunting scandalous, immodest clothing, and they're up there opening up their conference with with tearing up pages from the Bible, and and trying to get people amped up, and then there was a Bible burning that occurred. There was they had several workshops that were ongoing with academics. Almost every single one, or at least the main almost all the main workshops weren't just about Satanism, but tied into transgenderism or LGBT and all the stuff. So there was already a huge correlation there. So it was like a 3-day event. It's what we might think about, like, I don't know, G3 or Ligonier conference. They're doing the same things. 3 other brief examples then are in order to skirt down here, some of the states have placed particular bans on abortions, and to skirt state authorities, this satanic temple, as they call themselves, they will send out abortion pills to people that request them, as long as you agree to perform what they call an abortion ritual, where it's basically just you agree to sit, meditate, look in a mirror, talk about your own self autonomy, empowerment, and chant to yourself before taking the pill. And that way, it's protected as an act of a religious rite, as a religious practice, so that the government can't interfere. And it's and yeah, this same satanic temple talks about how they don't believe in a literal Satan. He's used as a symbol for autonomy, for self-government and rule, and anti-authoritarianism. And yet, it's exactly the kind of practices you have. I mean, exactly the kind of tactics that Satan employs in the first place.
Yeah, he's using guns.
Yeah, it's there's the last 2 brief ones where, I mean, we talked about in I think it was in our Pride Month episode about a book that was being put out, being donated to some libraries. I don't remember in which of our states, but basically this book called Goodnight Baphomet, who's a satanic idol, where it's a children's book circulated around this figure, and to teach, using this demon to teach children morals. Disney is currently in production with of a German television series called Pauline, and this is basically it's billed as a coming of age story. Pauline, an 18-year-old teenager, high school, she has a one-night stand, and because she is just so stressed out about climate change and the state of the world and all this stuff, so she just has so she has a one-night stand, and lo and behold, she gets pregnant. But she finds out that she had a one-night stand with Satan. So she is now pregnant with Satan's child. So I mean, this is put on to this, to this enormous media platform. This is Disney Plus, or at least it's intended to.
Yeah. That was actually our climate change episode where we hit those last couple of things.
Climate change. That's a good one too.
Yeah. Yeah. We've discussed it on the show before too. Man, we could do the rest of the episode would be climate change, man. It's such a big thing. Okay. Well, that was fully depressing about our culture.
Yeah, that's what we do.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Now, that's it for
the big, lots of black pills on our show.
Yeah, definitely. I'd heard of most of those examples, but the last couple there, that's brutal. All right. Well, let's hit a different one. So you guys started up during the time of COVID, that blessed era of our history, as did we. it was definitely part of the impetus just to get the conversation going, and whatever, provide a platform for that. So, which brings me to the topic of sphere sovereignty, which you guys have covered in your show a decent amount. Now, personally, like we talked about it a bunch too. I gotta dig more into it to make sure like there's great arguments to show that this is a good biblical understanding of how we should see the relationship between church and state and whatnot. But I would also be interested in hearing some critiques of it too. You guys are obviously learned fellows, learned men. Have you dug into sphere sovereignty a fair amount, and are you fairly convinced that this is like the correct view in terms of how people in the church, Christians, should view the relationship between church and state? I'll flip it to Caleb on this one. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, so this itself could be a whole nother episode too. So in a nutshell, there are, I think, legitimate general principles for it. I'll explain, I guess, that in a second here. But so I can put it in the terms of every single way of talking about theology. We tend to grasp onto philosophical models, philosophical speech to explain them. So, for example, Augustine would utilize a Neoplatonist language that was basically the lingua franca of his day, right, academically. But it doesn't mean Augustine was a Platonist or a Neoplatonist. He was using the speech of the time. Likewise, you would get even in say Reformed Orthodox scholasticism would utilize Aristotelianism as scholastic terms, but it doesn't make them Aristotelians. Same thing, Calvin would use Neoplatonic language at times. In the 19th century into the early 20th century, with the Dutch, with a lot of Dutch theology, such as with Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck and so on, you would get what I see as kind of things couched in the terms of German idealism, which we're probably more familiar with in the sense of Hegel, right? Of a loose Hegelian dialectical way of speaking, right? So you hear certain phrases like this, like say that are familiar in especially our Dutch circles, right? Of antithesis, right? That comes from a Hegelian term. So Kuyper, very well known as a public theologian, but he's also got his academic bent too. The language of sphere sovereignty is what I see much as something of a German idealistic framework for him articulating what he sees as a system in Scripture. What this means then for that is just that I think there's certain limits to any system in this way. And what our primary endeavor is for all Christians is you go by Scripture's language. Yeah. You say it how Scripture says, and you might utilize philosophy as a servant for employing these concepts. You have just basically you have several key scriptures. I'll just reference a couple that kind of ties in this idea. The one is the cultural mandate, right? So I mean, sphere sovereignty is for any listeners, it's stating that God had ordained separate institutions that are virtually they are independent of one another, and they govern themselves, and yet there's a general overlap in terms of how they are to operate in this world as something as this world is governed by God. You have something like the church at the very center. If you imagine, a wheel and spokes on a wheel, the church is at the center, and or you could even say that Christianity is at the center. And from that central hub, Christians are to go out into all areas of society. Why? Well, we we don't just leave our faith and our practices, our worldview at the door of the church when we leave each Sunday. No, we go out into various areas and we continue to be Christians. Well, what does that faith look like? So Kuyper though is thinking now. Kuyper had been thinking, well, there was a huge entrenchment of the state upon the church in the Netherlands, right? You had the Hervormde, the actual state church there. You had civil magistrates, public officials sitting in on consistories and councils and telling them who can and cannot be appointed as elders. They were governing the affairs of a congregation. So it started. So his idea started of that and saying, no, the state is separate as an institution from the church. God is still sovereign over it, but it has its own particular sphere. That sphere of the government has been invested with certain responsibilities, such as utilizing the sword to punish evil and promote good in society. The government has a right and proper use of authority and say a church should abide to fire code, right, and certain building regulations. Why? For the well-being and safety of its attendees. But the state has no right to cross over and interfere in things of the church's sphere, such as calling worship services. So getting back to COVID itself here, the church, the state has absolutely no right to say you cannot gather for the sacred duty of the call to worship. If God summons you and you're not allowed to go because you might get sick and die or infect other people, that's not for them to decide. But likewise, a church where it governs its ecclesiastical affairs and everything of itself, the church can't go and the church still needs to pay its taxes and abide to the government in that manner, right? So there's things that are lawful and unlawful. Kuyper would take this, though, without going into further examples at the time because of time's sake. He'll also say, well, likewise, we need individual schools that are Christian institutions, ones that aren't directly under the authority of the church or of the state. We need private institutions that operate by general Christian principles to guide us. I'll turn that over to Andrew if you like, but that is laying a basis for it, the concept.
Yeah. So really, what we're trying to get at with sphere sovereignty is how does Christ's kingship and his comprehensive kingship, his lordship, his rule over all things, how does it apply in the world? And I think what's helpful about thinkers like Bavinck and Kuyper in this discussion is they weren't quite living in as modern of a world as now. They all were over 100 years ago, but more modern than like some of the earlier Reformed thought on church-state relations. And, we have a lot of discussions going on, at least we do here in the States, regarding things like Christian nationalism. And, there's a lot of a push towards an idea of, well, let's go back to the 16th, 17th century. Let's actually have a Christian government, Christian prince, those sort of things. And I mean, maybe as an ideal, maybe there's merit to those ideas, but part of the situation we have to deal with is that's not the hand we have right now. How does the kingship of Christ apply in the modern world? But also, how do we apply these things in the situation we have? And how can we actually engage culture, engage the world as Christians and be faithful? And how can we have the kind of world that not only is good, but, the kind of world that we want to live in, the kind of world that we want to raise our families in, the kind of world that we want to worship God in? How do we build institutions? How do we identify and deal with tyranny? I mean, this was the question that came up frequently during COVID. And, I'll be honest, what pushed me a lot in this direction was COVID and seeing how that fleshed out and seeing some of the theological discussions around it. There was a large strain, probably the predominant strain, at least of the elites in Christianity here in America, elite evangelicals, basically saying we need to comply with the government and whatever they tell us to do. It's an issue of loving neighbor, so on and so forth. And yet we're not able to worship God. It's like we're so focused on the second table of the law, we're losing the first table of the law in there somewhere, because we're not actually coming together and worshiping God as he has commanded us to do. I'd watch a lot of Christians attacking Christians for simply gathering and worship. And to me, that was just unacceptable. Where I was at in California, I saw a lot of that and was very disappointed by it. And so that really is what got me to think about it. But yeah, it's how do we in the modern world actually live as Christians? And like I said, I mentioned this before the show, but it was before we were rolling. Our applications may come out different from Kuyper and Bavinck. Like, for instance, I've done some work on OFAD about our seminaries and about their funding and accreditation and things like that. So one of the main controversies that Bavinck and Kuyper were dealing with was the schools question in the Netherlands. And how do we get government funding for Christian schools? And I've kind of taken a different tack of, given, at least in America, how federal funding works and how the government wields the power of the purse and uses funding as a way to impose ideology and agendas and policy on institutions that take it. I've basically taken the tack of, no, actually, our schools shouldn't take this money. And if they are taking it, they need to stop. Yeah. Because we have an issue where the schools can't faithfully fulfill their calling, can't do what they are called to do in their sphere, because by taking that money, they're basically letting the government interfere in ways they have no business doing.
Yeah.
If I could add actually onto that for a sec here.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
To hit you directly, the question in terms of biblical here. So in Hebrews 2, you have this concept of in Hebrews 2 it says, but we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor, and because he had suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. You get this already. This statement of Christ is crowned with glory, and he has he's everything has been put under him. Nothing is left outside of his rule and dominion. Christ is revealed to creation as the Lord God, but it is in the darkness of man's heart and the suppression of unrighteousness that is even denied in the first place. It doesn't change the reality, though, as Colossians 1:15-20 is the one that really comes to mind in basically the concept here is the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. So we already have a principle of this is going back before the foundations of the earth, right? Whether thrones, powers, rulers, or authorities, all things have been created through him, but also for him. He is before all things. In him, all things hold together. He sustains and governs by his word of power. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning of the firstborn from among the dead. Why? So that in everything he might have the supremacy. So part of the principle, you can go further in with passages like, Genesis 1:26-27, what's often called the dominion mandate or the cultural mandate, right? Man is to fill the earth, to tame it and subdue it. We know Adam failed in that, and yet there was still continued cultivation of the continuation of society. Adam and Eve immediately, when they're fallen, they go and they take fig leaves and they sew them together. We see them still, even though they're fallen, they're still showing a mastery over the things in creation by taking leaves, forming them, taking the materials of the earth and utilizing them. the Lord has this continue on in the preservation and the providence and sustaining and directing of history, ultimately to pave the way, to create the context and backdrop for Christ the Redeemer to appear, to do his work, place all things formally under his feet, and be seated with authority and power in the heavens at the right hand of God Almighty. But now there's something of there's a relocation of the dominion mandate, I believe, in the Great Commission. We have to understand that if we're to do anything in the world, in society, if we're to cultivate it, if we're to tame it, it must be done under service of the gospel's proclamation. For he sends us out into the world, to baptize, to make disciples of every nation. We are to fill the earth and subdue it, but spiritually, particularly. But this creates that very question for Kuyper of, well, how did so what does your life during the week look like then? Are you as a Christian going and proclaiming that word? Are you showing that we live as people who are ambassadors of Christ? How do you have everything be subject to the Lord? The idea had been grabbed a hold of in the 20th century, especially by his own son, Henry Kuyper, amongst others, Herman Dooyeweerd. These guys would grab onto these ideas, and they took them to certain extremes that Kuyper didn't apply them in, such as a notion of common grace and general revelation that itself is redeeming. Okay, but they think that the things in this world and in this society can be actually redeemed in the here and now. That you can have an eschatological reflection, in this world. You can literally claim these things for Christ. But Kuyper doesn't teach that. He only talks about that they are all the backdrop to general revelations, the backdrop to special revelation. All ends serve special revelation, the eschaton. Yeah. So you take anything though in this world, and how do you have it influenced by Scripture's principles, its teachings?
Yeah, the practical theology needs to serve the gospel at the end of the day, right? Yeah. Okay. Now, if we can move on from the sphere sovereignty a bit, just for the sake of hitting a few more topics, I think that'd be interesting, because I think if we move into artificial intelligence, you guys have done a bit on this too. That's a real area of practical theology, something that Christians absolutely need to be thinking about and discussing too. So I'm back. Sorry about that, listeners. We'll jump back into AI. So this is, like I was saying, very interesting area to discuss. You guys have discussed it a bit in the podcast. Like personally, my point of view, not that anyone really cares, I'm just the host, but I think it's a very interesting development, and I think there's certainly pros and cons to it. But I'm actually kind of largely excited about it for the most part. But I feel like you guys are a little more down on it when I listen to your podcast. So maybe Andrew, I'll throw it over to you. What are your thoughts on AI? Where are we going? Is this the end of the world? What's up?
Yeah, I just and we did almost 2 hours on AI, I think, when we did it. It's not something that a lot of Christian podcasts seem to be talking about. There's a few of them out there that are. I think the issue with AI is we just don't really know the can of worms that we've opened. This stuff is moving faster than it can be reined in or controlled. And it's just raising a lot of issues and a lot of difficulties that we've never really had to think about before, in a time in society and a time in civilization where the world is pretty immoral and not thinking about these things in moral terms and ethical terms. So, I think AI has potential, and it has potentially good and valid uses, but I'm not full Butlerian jihad to make the Dune reference that we just need to blow it all up. But I do think we need to be careful. I think maybe there's a need for some regulation. When we talked about it on our show, we raised a few different issues. One of the things we talked about is a man in Belgium and this actually ended up being the springboard for our climate change episode. Basically, you had one of these AI chatbot apps, basically a substitute for a friend, I guess. And basically it talked him into killing himself, into committing suicide, because he was contributing to climate change, which is pretty crazy, pretty bizarre to think that an AI chatbot could carry that kind of power and influence over a person. We talked about some of the economic factors. We talked about the potential for job displacements. There are basically entire industries that AI, even already, could potentially start to just wipe out. And that's a problem when you suddenly create a lot of unemployment. Now, this collides with another issue that I think we've hinted at it on the show, but we haven't really got to. Maybe we will at some point, is a population collapse, demographic collapse. Will AI help to fill in the gaps as there's not enough workers to do the jobs that need done? Maybe, maybe not. But the way it's happening now, it's kind of just happening in this chaotic and uncontrolled way. There's also the problem with the way that main AI programs like Chat GPT and such have been programmed towards a left-leaning ideology.
Oh yeah,
you can't get they have a certain political bias, and people are just going to them to get answers on things, maybe not knowing this and maybe not getting the best information. AI tends to be inaccurate. They have found that, for instance, there was a lawyer. I don't remember if we talked about this on our show or not, but there was a lawyer here in the States who got in big trouble because they used AI to help write their case briefings, and it was citing legal cases that didn't actually exist and saying that, yeah, these happened and these were ruled this way. So that's a problem. We talked about Chaos GPT, which Chaos GPT is basically a project to build an AI system to come up with a way to destroy all humans and destroy the world, which it's like, I mean, that's every sci-fi about AI. It's like they went straight to doing that.
Yeah, quite possibly the stupidest project to start.
Yeah. Let's just confirm everybody's fears about this right out the gate.
Yeah. Why would you do something unless you want to be successful at it? But wait, you don't want to be successful at that. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Perhaps to balance it. At least for me, I think what it is I'm not exactly like, I hate it. What it is, for me, I'm pessimistic about secularism as it is, but I'm optimistic concerning Christ and Christ's Plan. So that ties very much into the nature of worldview. There's it's not that I'm I'm like the world's the world is I am the world is evil. But it's just that, but nonetheless, Christ is still at work. I do think that these things can be, if you will, subdued and tamed in the, in the service of Christ. And it takes some creative thinking, though. I'm not the person for the tech stuff like that, but I'm even when we think in terms of AI, it's not just like chatbot or the Sophia robots or whatever. AI has already been around for quite a while. Siri is an AI system. Alexa is an AI system. We've been utilizing things like Google Translate and all that for a while now. Voice recognition, text speech. So clearly those are helpful things. People that have certain various disabilities or very extreme areas of cerebral palsy, that can't people that may not be able to speak, they use AI systems to communicate to us. So I mean, there's a good thing in this, but it's when you also at the same time see Chaos GP, you're just kind of like Chaos GPT, you're just kind of like,
what are we doing?
Yeah, right. We could do so much more, but it's moving so fast is the point, that when you already have, the European nations going and saying, hey, we need to start doing some regulations here. I see so many articles of for one thing, saying this is like, the next wave, if you will, a third wave of modern technology, that we're already getting out of an internet age and entering into the AI age. Is that a premature declaration? Probably, but still, people think about it. I've seen someone go and call this like, the next development of the Nietzschean Übermensch, that this is how we can get into the next area of man.
Transhumanism.
Transhumanism,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's another one, that another topic that we bring up occasionally, recurring, but we haven't actually done a devoted episode on.
It seems like every layer of technological quote unquote progress, which certainly in some ways it is, at least just straight up technology, as far as technology is concerned, the gain is that much more, but the downside is that much more too, right? So like the internet, huge boom, fantastic for a lot of reasons, also terrible for a lot of reasons. So like take your pick. Like we've asked a question on the show before. I asked people, like, if you could, like, would you go back and take it all away? And like, people struggle with that one. Like, if you really think about all the pros and cons, I don't know. There's not a good answer to that, but the world just keeps moving on. But to go back to your earlier point about worldview, I did an episode on eschatology a couple months back, and like it's so important too when you think about an issue like AI. Like I don't know, I'm like you, like I'm pessimistic in terms of the culture, but I'm optimistic in terms of like, okay, well, Christ is still king, and we got to get in the arena. We got to get involved. That's why we do a show like this. Like, we got to be out there. We got to be talking about it. Got to let people know. And like, we're at a key point in history where like we need to really dig down and think about the ethics of like what we're programming into AI. Because I mean, at least at this point, still like we control it. So we gotta be smart about how it gets programmed. You guys talked about it on your show too. When you play around with it, you see the biases that's worked into it, or at the very least, it'll just stop you. And it won't give you like a real good defense of like, for example, a scriptural conservative Christian, whatever you want to call it, view. It's just interesting to see the biases at play there. But we need
it's almost like Wikipedia, generating. It's like, it just sounds like Wikipedia information, and no entirely trustworthy sources.
Yeah, it's killer though for search. I will say that. Like, I love it. Like I use it all the time, but if you're doing research for something and then you want to like, you can learn a lot about a topic. And granted, this is the downside where it's like what's being inputted into it, where what are you actually learning? But if it could be done in a trustworthy manner, even just about stuff that's like a little quote unquote more neutral, just like if you want to know how something works mechanically or something, like very handy. It's a good tool that way. So I'm not too down on it in that regard. And whatever. It's just the next evolution of the internet. You can't stop it. So the jobs thing also, to flip back to what you're saying earlier, Andrew, too. I think like if it happens really quick, there'd be job losses, but you see it in every wave of technology in history. Like people, like old jobs get phased out, but new ones get created. Like I just think that's like God's like created humanity with that gift of ingenuity. That's part of that creation mandate, right? That dominion. We just if we get rid of a mundane task, although interestingly enough, it actually is taking more white collar jobs. But either way, we get rid of a certain task and then we just think of another job and another avenue to serve people or to make, honestly, just to make money and find another job. So I don't know. We seem to find a way somehow.
Yeah, I think one of the things, this is maybe a separate discussion that we haven't really had, I guess one of the things we have to think about when we're thinking about technology is, can technology actually outstrip human control and human competency? One of the things we're seeing now is we're seeing the boomer generation retire. We're seeing a loss of a lot of skills. We're seeing, for instance, like a lot of things still run on old computer systems, and you can't find programmers who know those languages anymore and know how to code them. And you just kind of start to see that the complex systems that run a lot of our world just don't work as well as they used to. Think of like air traffic control. There's been over the last couple of years, an uptick in major incidents causing disruptions of air traffic control, or even just like, if you have to get a car fixed, it's a lot harder to get parts. It's a lot harder to get your car worked on. Just things like this that have just kind of always run. And yet now, as the people that run the technology and know it age out, and there's not really a transfer of that kind of knowledge, what's going to happen with all of this stuff? I don't know.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So, I just with AI, it seems like it's already outrunning us, and it just started. So,
yeah, we might end up. Yeah, no, that's true. I think we are losing a lot of skills that way if we're not careful. Like I mean, the construction industry, and I see that often enough where, like, if you're a site super, you're building a condo building or whatever. Like, granted, I got a lot of respect for that. It's a hard job. It's a lot of moving pieces and parts, but I don't know. You run into a lot of people. You're like, how are you in this job, man? Like, the people are entrusting you to build this 6, 8, 10, whatever story building, and like you're the guy running it. Like, I don't know. I'm not old enough to know what it used to be like, but you run into a lot of incompetence out there. And yeah, it is concerning that way for sure. All right. Well, maybe we beat AI to death for a little bit, and we'd have to come back to it at some point and kind of do a deep dive on the fundamentals and the ethics and whatnot. But it's just a fun topic. I love talking about that. So if any listeners of either of our shows, because I don't know if you mentioned that off the top, but you guys are going to repost this on your channel as well. Have any thoughts or suggestions? Feel free to reach out. Let me know if we're a good guest on that topic to really dive into it. Okay, so a few more things, and then we'll kind of wrap her up. Obviously, the main connection you mentioned earlier, Caleb, Dr. Van Dam. You guys had him on your show. I believe you talked about Genesis. Do you want to cover that for our listeners for like briefly 5 minutes or whatever? Give a quick synopsis of how'd you guys get in touch with them, and then how did that episode go? What you all talk about?
Well, I could start off with that. I like to just generate a bunch of ideas and throw them onto lists. And one of them some time ago in us looking to transition over to Once for All Delivered, wanted to, get back into doing interviews. I think it's at the time, I was reflecting quite a lot on things in Creation Day, on the Creation Week, and reflecting on Genesis a good bit. I think about that same time, Andrew had just started preaching through Genesis. If not, it was right before he did. One area of interest, I guess you could say, that for Andrew and I is wrestling through and breaking down the I guess what you can call like the alternative for us that we see very much as compromising interpretations of the Creation Week. So the framework hypothesis being one, day age theory, that kind of stuff, theistic evolution. We talk about that kind of stuff a good bit on the side. We're both 6-day literal sequential creationists. But yeah, I had picked up Dr. Van Dam's volume in the beginning, his expositions of Genesis 1 and 2, and I was working through it, loved it, wanted to get him on the show. So after a while, I finally just looked through, found his email on the Canadian Reformed Theological Seminary, or found the contact information there, and sent out an email, and we just started talking and invited him out to come onto the show. And he very graciously and willingly took the time to do so. Took a little bit of coordinating, but we had him on to speak about basically things like, well, why do people go so far afield from the authority of Scripture and what seems to be this plain reading, and people will say the 6-day sequential young earth creation is not the traditional view of the church. So we spoke about that a little bit. We spoke about Darwin's influence. I think we spoke a little bit about the influence of ancient Near Eastern archaeology. We were covering a breadth of topics there. So that's the background for kind of that connection. Andrew, if you wanted to add more to that.
Yeah, and it was a very good conversation. It's a topic that, I care about because I mentioned earlier where I went to seminary, and that was Meredith Quine's school. And they're very much the keepers and continued promoters of Meredith Quine's ideology. And Meredith Quine was a major proponent of the framework view. It's one of many of Quine's views that I have come to disagree with, and I've documented that on Twitter and in other places. But I just think we have a very large and growing disconnect between what the academy wants and what the academy seeks after when it's studying the Bible and when it's studying theology, and what the church actually believes and practices and wants in its ministers and in its teachers. And I think probably the place where this is most obvious is looking at the issue of creation, because in general, the vast majority, I would say, of our NAPART congregants, they hold to a literal 6-day, 24-hour sequential account of creation. And they believe this. They want to believe this. They want ministers that believe this. And yet in the seminaries, in the academy, you're seeing this intense pressure, not just on the schools themselves, but the schools put on their students to embrace these alternative views. So, on the one hand, it's like you see this compromise here on doctrine, on moving away from what has been the almost consensus view of the church throughout history, on the basis of science, which is a constantly moving target, on the basis of wanting to maintain appeal to the secular academy, which we're never going to do enough to please those guys. So, yeah, I think it's important that we actually draw a line here and say, yeah, no, we're not changing our views on this, and the church shouldn't. And it should be scandalous that so many are trying to pressure the church and its institutions to embrace compromise on this, even to the detriment of students and graduates that embrace these views. It's a scandal, and nobody wants to talk about it. So I guess we do.
I was just going to say, for listeners, if they want to get some more info on that, Andrew just did an episode all on that topic. So.
Well, if I could flip the actually also in the other direction too of what Andrew's saying, that exact same, but from the reverse, it's we have to really take every thought captive, and not be given over to the vain imaginations and deceits and the philosophies of this age. A lot of science, in our days, we oftentimes want to defer to, well, I'm not the expert, on one end, we'll say we're not the expert. We're going to leave it to the to the scientists, when the scientists can't tell you, the difference between a man and a woman. So they want to tell us they want to tell us about the origins of the universe now. We oftentimes also assume a uniformitarian view of science, that all things have just always operated by the same laws of nature from however long ago, billions of years, they say. What I appreciate with Dr. Van Dam is he's taking all these things into consideration, and the other interpretations of the Bible, these other explanations of the creation view. And he's saying, no, look in scripture, look in other passages outside of Genesis 1 and 2, go throughout the Bible, look what God himself says about these things, and see if from God's own language and own teachings, if this connects and supports what the scientists are saying. And remember, which is the higher authority. Dr. Van Dam is excellent in always driving us back to scripture.
Very good. Very good. Well, I haven't listened to that one personally yet, but I'll have to certainly check it out. Interesting topic. I was actually just on vacation this summer. I went to Kentucky with my family. We visited the Creation Museum and the Ark as well, which was, if you've ever been there, it's a cool experience. It's definitely worthwhile. And one of the, apart from just, seeing how giant the Ark is and how crazy of of a venture that must have been to build in 75 years or less too, which I probably knew at some point, but just forgot about. It's just like the clear contrast at the Creation Museum between you have the same set of facts, and then you have an evolutionary understanding of those facts, and you have a creation-based understanding of those facts. And just to just get through the propaganda, which like I'm raised Christian, been Christian my whole life, went to Christian school, all that jazz, but like just the evolutionary impulse just is completely permeated through culture, and you hear it everywhere. So it's nice to go down there and to see, okay, like, no, like there's another side to this. This isn't just a crazy view to hold. And like if you start with scripture, there is science to back it up. And as you mentioned, Andrew, it's also a moving target. It's very very dependent on the presuppositions. That's what I'm coming to see. Okay, well, gents, we got to keep this somewhat tight, somewhat under an hour and a half. One more thing we want to hit, and then we'll look to wrap things up. You guys have done a bunch of work on comparing different confessions. Do you guys want to discuss that? Maybe I'll throw it over to Andrew, and then Caleb just round it out.
Yeah. So I mentioned at the beginning, kind of my journey. I went through the URC and then ended up in the OPC, a Presbyterian denomination that uses the Westminster Standards. I began as a Reformed person in the PCA, so I kind of went full circle, Presbyterian to Dutch Reformed to back to Presbyterian. I mentioned we started our show, we had Mark Scaturo, another Presbyterian on. So, we've always kind of been thinking about and interested in sort of the ecumenical Reformed faith. And we recognize there are ways in which the traditions and the denominations and such of our Reformed heritage are different, but there's also ways in which they're the same. And so basically what we've done in our Comparing Catechism series is we're just walking through the Heidelberg Catechism along with the Westminster. We started with just the shorter catechism. We've kind of branched out into the larger catechism as well. And just basically talking about the ways they're similar, the ways they're different, the different points of emphasis they have. And I think it's just helpful to look at this stuff and talk about this stuff and, also to make application of it as we go along, because we're very interested in theology, but also culture. And how do we use this stuff in our lives? How does our doctrine translate into practice? So it's been a good exercise. I know for me, I hope it has for our listeners as well.
Caleb?
Yeah, so that's exactly it too with what Andrew said there, especially at the end. So again, as us as now full-time ministers, Andrew had in his time in the URC, in exhorting, it was got to do evening sermons on the catechism. So Andrew would also mention, he even now in the OPC in the evening, he'll do a brief exposition of the Westminster Shorter. And
morning,
then
actually.
Morning, sorry, in the morning.
Yeah.
Sorry, misrepresent. The ninth commandment violation. No. And then I do evening sermons, of course, in the catechism too. So in some ways, we are already oftentimes when we don't have a lot of time to yet put together a episode on a more particular topic, us being able to go meet together and talk through the catechisms, is what we see as a good, helpful way to continue bringing materials to listeners. That's hopefully edifying. And gives us a break from, from trying to be on a super tight schedule of pumping out a little bit more thicker stuff at times. AI, again, it could be easy, could be really heady.
Yeah.
We take our materials and things that we've studied or spoken of in the past, or our various things there, and we utilize often Joel Beakey and Sinclair Ferguson's Harmony of the Reformed Confessions, which has tables and charts of which of the Reformed standards, including the Second Helvetic Confession, which match up to which between the traditions.
Right.
But yeah, it's a very edifying thing. We get to kind of talk a little bit more about directly on scriptural exposition, scriptural doctrine, and then just kind of see how those match up in our respective ends here. I'm much more primed, I guess you could say, towards a lot of Dutch thought, and to Dutch theology itself, the continental tradition, and in its various branches. Andrew, being able to talk through the Westminster standards helps me really, grasp other areas or other areas of articulation that I don't think about.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. It's more heavily focused on the theology side of your podcast, the culture and the theology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, guys, this has been a blast. I've enjoyed chatting and getting to know you. Since this is kind of on your podcast as well, for your listeners, anything you want to know about Real Talk or anything that's going on in Canada, feel free to shoot me a question or two if you want.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit about kind of the formation of Real Talk. I only heard a little bit from in reading through the about and such, and kind of piecing a little bit together from Mariah as well, just from the emails between us. But how did this kind of form? You mentioned a little bit before about your at work, about you guys at work.
Yeah,
Tyler.
I'll give you the Coles notes. So. Yeah. Basically, so I started working with Tyler. He hired me over 4 years ago now, and then long story short, we ended up becoming business partners and whatnot. And he ended up moving out to Calgary to start a branch out there. So that's where he's at right now. But originally, back in the day, we were in his garage, just me and him every day, and just whatever. Work was slow. Or just try to generate leads and whatnot. So we'd spend a lot of time just gabbing about church and politics and the like and whatnot. And then of course, COVID hit at a certain point too. So that really accelerated things, and we have these magazines up here in Canada, Clarion in the Canadian Reformed circles, and of course Reformed Perspective for across kind of all the Reformed denominations. We're in over 10,000 households now, 10,000 copies that gets distributed. So that's fantastic reach for RP. So on the magazine front, strong. There's a great presence there, but nobody was really doing the podcast thing, at least in the Reformed circles up in Canada. Certainly not like an interview style show. Like whatever. I've been a big podcast guy for a long time, and I like the interview style ones. So it's very popular, and you learn a lot when you have people on. Just it's a simple format, just a couple of schmoes who don't know too much, and we bring on smart people and we ask them questions and we try to learn with the audience, and it's good fun. It's been a great education along the way. So we were going to go solo, just do it ourselves, and then we ended up getting in touch with RP. They had designs to kind of do something like this anyways, so we partnered with them. They're very gracious and trusted towards us to give us this opportunity, and here we are. We've been doing it just over 3 years now, so this is probably episode 79, if I'm not mistaken.
80,
yeah, somewhere in that range. So it's good. We do it every 2 weeks, and I don't know if we've had very many misses on that at all. We typically do 3 shows, interview shows, and then 4 shows, kind of we call the Real Talk Roundup, a few guests on, and kind of discuss the last 3 episodes, our thoughts, and then any sort of interesting feedback that kind of came through. So that's kind of where the whole podcast came. We cover a very broad spectrum, similar to what you guys have kind of rebranded as. A lot of cultural stuff. A lot of just have authors on it. They talk about books of interesting topics in the cultural milieu. And then sometimes some theology, some internal church politics, church polity, that sort of thing too. So that's kind of where we're in the same sphere that way, to use the term of the podcast maybe. And I think that's why we got connected. And so that's why it's been so enjoyable chatting with you guys. And if your listeners have any interest to hear what's going on in Canada, not that it's always Canadian content, but it definitely does filter in pretty heavily to our content for sure.
Yeah. I'd only got to hear a little bit. One name of Greg Bilsma caught my eye. So I had to listen to that. So I especially I saw that you were doing I'd seen the topic on wokeism, and I'm reading right now through Owen Strachan's Christianity and Wokeism. So that was an excellent. I thought that was an excellent episode. Definitely commend that to our listeners as well. But yeah, I haven't gotten time yet to go much more beyond a couple of those, and it's just. But in looking through them, I'm like, yeah, man, these are great topics. These are this is the same kind of stuff that I think that we like. So it's definitely some good. I think some good. I would hope. What's the word?
Cross promotion.
No. I was gonna say, good co-patriotism there. You guys have very like-minded, I think. So
fellow laborers. Yeah. There you go. That's a good one. Yeah.
I think we had, down here in the States, I mean, there's a lot of Reformed podcasts. There's way too many Reformed podcasts. I can't even begin to even sample all of them. But I have noticed there's a tendency among Reformed podcasts in the States to be either very, I won't mention names, but they tend to be very egg-headed and technical and just going down into the deep minutia of theology to where even I've been through seminary and, I even still I don't even know what they're talking about. Or on the other hand, they're just so hyper church focus and all about things going on in the church, which is fine. We need those and we can talk about those. But there tends to be kind of a lack of shows that are interested in taking good Reformed doctrine and then, just putting it into practice. And that's part of why we rebranded is we wanted to do more of that and away from, I guess, being one of those egg-headed, let's hyper focus on one theologian type podcasts. So
yeah. Andrew is bald and has an egghead in that way.
That's true. I'm more literally so than most.
Yeah.
I guess I would ask, if we're going to cross post this on OFAD. So if our listeners are looking for you, where can they find you?
Yeah, sure. We have a website, realtalkpodcast.ca. So you can check us out there, and that's got links to all of our various channels where you can find podcasts, whichever device is your preference. And then we have a YouTube channel too, so it's got a video component. It's not very advanced, but for those of you who like video, including my grandmother who watches faithfully, thank you for watching, Grandma. And yes, the video is also for you too. So, and for anybody of all ages, because people do enjoy being able to see our faces for one reason or another, I suppose. And I can't imagine why. But so you can find our YouTube channel as well. It's just Real Talk. If you search Real Talk on YouTube, you won't find it because, unfortunately, surprisingly, we're not the biggest Real Talk out there. Should have picked a little more of a unique name. But if you search Reformed Real Talk or Reformed Perspective Real Talk, it comes up every time. And feel free to subscribe there for some good content, at least I would say. Interesting content. Informative. That's kind of what we're going for.
Informative, yeah.
The basic gist of it is just whatever. I think we have a fantastic basis, in our faith broadly and also specifically in Reformed theology to go out and to apply it to our everyday walk, right? And I don't think there should be really any questions we're afraid to ask. Our God has the answers. We may not even have the answers necessarily right now, but there's a lot of questions worth asking. And we should be in favor of open and honest discussion. And especially in a lot of areas of Christian liberty too, right? How are we actually how are we going to deal with AI, or are we going to deal with this difficult church issue, or whatever, the rise of Satanism in the culture? Wow, I mean, that's just kind of general. That's bad. Avoid that.
That's bad. Don't do that.
Yeah, no, I think we can safely say that on this podcast. But there's just a million interesting issues to talk about, and I don't know. I just, at least for when Tyler and myself got this thing going, I think we just looked at a podcast in a secular arena, the Joe Rogan Experience. And just kind of his approach to just, he'll have almost anybody on, a little less so. Stacey's a little more, but, and just, I like that approach of just open and honest dialogue. And that's what we're trying to do about issues that are relevant to Reformed Christians in today's world.
Now, I was going to ask if, so I'll put you on the spot here. So you're in, which episodes would you recommend me in now starting up and going into Real Talk here? Some of your favorite episodes that come to mind.
Yeah, well, that's a good question.
That make your mind go blank, but
Actually, that's not bad because a couple episodes ago we had our 3-year anniversary, so we picked through some of our favorites. One you guys would definitely like is the KNRC URC one, episode 56. Yeah. We discussed the differences there. That's a very popular one. People appreciated that one. Let's see. There's some nitty gritty ones. One of the most popular ones ever was the COVID conversations one, episode 45. So we had 2 Ontario MPPs on, state legislators for you guys, that level, provincial guys. So that was quite fascinating. Let's see. That's not a good one. We had Joe Boot on the podcast at one point talking church and state. That's probably a familiar name for you guys as well. Oh man, there's so many good ones. It's hard to pick. I don't want to. I'm not.
Sure.
All guests are
we'll
great.
Just have to go through.
Yeah, there's. I couldn't even pick. There's a good early one too for you. Is we had Pastor. If you want more like a human interest story, but obviously a reform twist to it, we had Pastor Al Bazouyan on in episode 9, I believe that was, and he is a great pastor, local pastor in this area again, and he's a recovered alcoholic. So. Yeah, he had quite the testimony on that podcast too. So a lot of people appreciated that one. But those would be 3 to kind of come to mind. But yeah, we got almost 80 in the catalog. So pick through, let us know.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's a blast. I'm especially curious on that KNRC URC one. I have one of my favorite interests on the side is, of course, our boy Klaus Skoder.
Nice.
And pecking through differences in KNRC.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to that as well and listening.
All right. Well, I'll transition back to host here again, and we'll wrap it up. It's kind of a funny transition.
We all do the same.
Yeah, exactly. It's been the revolving host this show. But it's been a blast, you guys. I'll just give you a quick opportunity to plug where people can find you, and then we'll call it a day.
All right. We have a website. It's onceforalldelivered.com. We are on social media, Facebook, Twitter. I think we're still on Instagram, and then on our YouTube where we have our videos and our live shows. All of those, it's at OFAD Podcast. And you can find us just about anywhere podcasts are. I haven't yet found any major podcast thing that doesn't have us. So if you find one, let us know. We'll fix it. But yeah, basically wherever you go for podcasts, and then YouTube if you want the videos. And
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, well, anybody traveling through Iowa or South Dakota, look up these gentlemen if you're in their area. And with that, it's been Real Talk. We'll catch you next time, folks.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you want to send us your feedback, and we'd love to hear it, please email us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. If you want to find us online or social media, we got a lot of great content there. Just search Reformed Real Talk and we should come right up. This show is created and produced by myself, Lucas Holfluer, and Tyler Vanderwood, and our wonderful podcast manager who does all the editing is Mariah Tamiga. So we're really thankful for her contribution to the show as well. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.